Welcome, everyone, on this 14th day of April 2016. This, of course, is the MMA Beat. I am your fill-in host today. My name is Luke Thomas. I am, of course, of MMA Fighting and SiriusXM. Joining me to my left is Jeff Wagenheim of Sports Illustrated and the Washington Post. And then at the very end, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. In absentia is the world's greatest New Yorker, who's in Tampa, Ariel Helwani. He missed today's MSG thing. I couldn't tell if he was upset about it or not.
No, it seemed okay.
The crying emojis didn't tip you off.
It certainly did not. Lots to get to today. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to kick things off, actually, if I can, right away, guys, with what happened today. Now, Jeff was lazy this morning. I don't know what his excuse was. Chuck and I actually were able to attend at 10 a.m. this morning, 10:30, I should say, the signing. MMA is now officially legal in the state of New York. All the consternation is over. Chuck, I'm going to start with you only because you were there. Apologies, Jeff.
It's okay, I was lazy, I slept in.
I wish I could have too. I am hungover. Anyway, Chuck, let's kick things off with that. Your impressions overall of the event. It seemed like a very festive atmosphere. I want to get to the story about the November 12th announcement in just a second, but overall, what were your impressions of today's event?
Yeah, man, it was really cool, and I felt like for a lot of the players who were there, Fertitta, Mark Ratner, even some of the fighters like Chris Weidman, they've been through this so many times that you could see that they thought it was a little bit surreal that they finally arrived at this moment where it's happening. And you've got Governor Cuomo up there basically talking about MMA and making jokes about MMA and saying like, hey,
he had a lot of jokes today.
It was just a really light atmosphere, and it was very cool. And you're sitting there at Madison Square Garden and you think, well, this is the Mecca, right? This is where fighting was supposed to happen. They're going back to all the great boxing matches of the day, and it just felt like finally we were caught up to the times. And I felt like a lot of the people in there had that sense of relief on them today. And even talking to guys like Mark Ratner and getting word with Lorenzo Fertitta, you could sense that a little bit, like a little bit exhausted from this whole process, but glad that we finally got to this moment.
And ready to hit the ground running, Jeff. They announced November 12th. It's official. They're going to bring a show to Madison Square Garden. It's going to be officially UFC 205 is the number. Again, we don't really know who's going to be on it. You had Weidman in attendance today. You had Rousey in attendance today, although they did not speak to the media. They were gone quickly when that thing was over. But let me ask you now that the gears are in motion, what are you anticipating for this card? And what was your impression now that, so to piggyback Chuck here, of today's signing?
Well, I had kind of been talking about this as not such a huge deal for quite a while. The fights were happening over in Newark, a 15-minute train ride away from Manhattan. Every other state in the country made it legal. It was almost like, well, I know that this is a thing that UFC's talked about, but is it really that big a deal? But today, I actually found myself kind of excited by it. I mean, I realized that it is a much bigger deal for one thing, to wipe out that stigma of, well, it's not legal in that one place. Even though it's only one place, it's no longer the case. So I think it's a big, huge thing. I guess I was very taken by the presence there of Ronda Rousey. Chris Weidman, right from Long Island. It makes sense that he would be a guy who they'd bring in. Ronda Rousey's not from around here, so they brought her in because of her star power. And the governor made a statement about, wouldn't it be cool if our first fight card was had Ronda Rousey on it? Now, Andrew Cuomo is not just the governor, but he was a former attorney general. And as you know, lawyers don't ask questions unless they know the answer, and politicians don't make statements unless they have a sense of what's going to be happening. So I'd be shocked if Ronda Rousey's not.
Actually, and also, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit. It actually coincides, obviously, with her time frame that's been her time frame for a long time of returning. And you think if she's going to come back within the November, December, within that little space of time, Madison Square Garden would be the right place for her. But of course, you're going to have everybody basically, anybody within the New York, New Jersey who's been waiting for this to happen is going to want to be on that card. But I feel like Ronda Rousey, of all people, would be the one that they might bring in to be like one of the outsiders to maybe be the headliner for that card.
And look, I'll just add this. I think you guys kind of nailed it. But for me, it does feel different. And I can't quite put my finger on why. But Thomas Gerbasi was sitting behind us from UFC.com, and he was showing us pictures because he actually got to go inside Madison Square Garden and see they put on the Jumbotron the UFC logo. There's a certain feeling to it. I just got to be honest. And maybe it's because we're part of this whole thing where we're wrapped up in it. But I do believe that this is something special on its own terms.
And, it's like, if you're watching like the social media feed, you've got the New York Knicks, the New York Mets, and all of these, teams basically.
Were they tweeting about it?
Yeah, they're all tweeting about it. Welcome to the UFC. And it's a really cool thing. Madison Square Garden, you can really relate to some of the great. If you're a boxing fan at all, you can go back and pick any number of really big, high-profile events, Frazier and Ali, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you could find so many and say, like, it was the center of the universe, the center of the fighting universe. And I feel like the UFC, which has sort of, moved into the space of consistently being the bigger fights, I think, at this point, finally gets to go to Madison Square Garden, and they circled the date, and I felt like it all came home today. Like, it was like finally that moment. 2007 is when the UFC started actually going into that market and saying, like, guys, let's get this thing done. Wow. It's been 10 years, It's like, so for it to finally get here, it seems a little ridiculous, but getting past all of that, it's like we finally made it. And that was the feeling in there today.
Yeah. I grew up in this area, so the Garden has always had a special place for me, even though I haven't lived in this area for quite some time. But I still, when I'm in the city and I walk past the Garden, I still get a certain feeling that I, just from growing up and going to games. And I think the first time I ever went to the Ringling Brothers Circus, when I was a little kid, was at the Garden. Right. So a lot of things certainly for me resonated when I heard about this today. But even you guys who are not from this area, as Chuck just said, it is a mecca. It is a mecca for not just combat sports, but for sports in general. And symbolically, this is a huge deal, and I'm looking forward to it immensely.
Last word on this.
It was interesting too because there were a lot of other New York fighters in there. There's Chris Weidman, we had Aljamain Sterling was in there. I know Ryan LaFleur was in there.
Chris
Wade, Dennis Bermudez. There was a bunch of those guys in there, and you realize like the dilemma is going to be with the matchmaking. Who wants to be on that first card? And I kind of asked Lorenzo Fertitta about that. I said, is that why you guys have an extra event coming up in December, possibly in upstate New York? He said that was most likely going to happen. That all the overflow that you can't get on that MSG card from the area, and he was like, well, that is something that we were laughing at with the matchmakers. Is at least we have this other card where you can say, well, you can't all be on UFC 200, but you can be on this next card. You know what I mean? So a big line to get in there, and that novelty of that first one at MSG is going to be the biggest.
All right, so we go from great news to terrible news. Lyoto Machida was flagged for a potential USADA violation, although he sort of admitted to what he had believed caused the flagging. It was a substance called DHEA. I won't get into the longer name of it. But the fight with Dan Henderson, the rematch that was supposed to take place this weekend at UFC on Fox 19, that is off. It looks like Dan Henderson has a rematch as of the time of this video, but we'll get into that later. Lyoto Machida. Okay. We now have two fighters in a row, coincidentally closer to 40 than 30, who have been flagged for different supplement issues. Now, Yoel Romero's issue is different than Lyoto Machida's issue. Yoel Romero was talking about essentially how hard it is to determine the veracity of the ingredient list in supplements. The other is very different. This, to me, I cannot believe. We got USADA, or the UFC got USADA for what? Because we really want to get rid of serious PED abusers. And it looks to me like we're getting rid of people who shop at GNC. The thing he banned for has no anabolic profile. It helps with immune function, slight energy, some weight loss depending on person to person, but even those are not really scientifically valid yet. The substances that are added to the WADA list for prohibited substances, it has to fulfill 2 or 3 criteria. 1, it has to be performance enhancing. 2, it has to be harmful to athletes. And 3, against the spirit of the sport. Leaving aside how utterly ridiculous and nebulous that is, how on earth is what he took contributory to that? How does it meet those criteria? It does not. This is absurd. And even if you want to make an argument that, okay, there's a certain amount of due diligence a professional athlete has to make, I can buy that. You know it's on there. No matter how ridiculous it may be that it's on there, you do your homework. Okay, 2 years he might go down for this? This is utterly irrational. Totally irrational. Jeff, talk me down from the ledge. Am I crazy?
Well, no, I think you are encompassing the bigger picture of this, but I think that we have to look at the smaller picture, which is the incidents with Machida and previously with Romero. And those are very different things procedurally. Romero, I think it is reasonable for a person to believe that the thing all that list on the of ingredients on the label, that's what's in there. And I think it's reasonable for someone to assume that other stuff is not in there if it's not on the label, because all these labels have a ton of stuff on there, so They must include everything. Well, apparently not. I think it's reasonable for him to make that assumption, and And I think that the way that he negotiated down from what would have been a longer suspension, I think it reveals that it was reasonable. USADA even acknowledged that it was reasonable. Machida, on the other hand, while I agree with you, I mean, I was also surprised because I was trying to do a little research on this stuff, and I take some supplements, and I looked online and saw that this stuff is made by the same companies that make some of my different supplements I take, just for regular health stuff. And usually, whenever these guys pop for something, it's some kind of obscure thing. This was like a very widely available stuff at Vitamin Shop or any of those kind of places. However, it is on the list, and it is his responsibility to not take anything that is on a list of banned substances. Whether it should be banned or shouldn't be banned, it's almost like we're moving more into like the Nick Diaz. Well, should marijuana be illegal or not? It's it's kind of in that realm. And while maybe I've always been prejudiced in favor of Diaz in his situations because I think there are times when some of his tests have come out shoddily tested. But this one, I guess I feel like Machida needed to. He did acknowledge that he took this stuff, but he needed to do his due diligence beforehand and say, okay, well, this is on the list. I've been taking this stuff, and I don't know, man. I don't think that he should have the book thrown at him, but he did the deed.
To me, that's the whole thing too. It's like you mentioned 2 years. That's sort of absurd when you consider what this is.
Could be the end of his career.
That's exactly right, because he's 37 years old, and I mean, when you first hear it, and you really don't know exactly what the situation is, and obviously we only know this one component. I don't know if there's more to this story, because obviously Dan Henderson's tweet makes you wonder if there is more to the story. But he's 37 years old. He's I think won only 6 of his last 14 or 13 fights, something like that. At first I was thinking maybe he was trying to get a little something rolling for himself again, and it was kind of a surprise to anybody who was these purists of the sport who really pictured Machida as that guy, the pure guy in the sport. But then you realize it is something like this, and it strikes me almost like where it was banned in 2012, right, for the Olympics, and you wonder
just before the London Games,
and you're like,
Beijing Games, whatever it was.
What led to that? Because right now I just don't see why it was banned to begin with, and then you have to get into the associations with. Did they lump it into something? Was it thoroughly looked at? Why is this illegal to begin with? And then you have to look at the penalty and say is that legit for something that's not a performance-enhancing drug? And it goes into what you're saying, sort of the marijuana thing. There should be a different scale for these types of things. So it's very confusing. But I do feel I agree with both you guys, honestly. For him to get in trouble for something like this is a little bit. It's out there a little bit, but the punishment, obviously, it won't fit. If it's 2 years, it just won't fit the crime.
Everyone thinks that WADA is a bunch of chin-scratching doctors of the highest morality and with the most rigorous process. Only the things that surely must be so detrimental to sport get added to the WADA prohibited list. They used to have caffeine on the WADA prohibited list, and as late as 2010, they were considering bringing it back. You mean to tell me a cup of coffee is what's going to make Lyoto Machida beat Dan Henderson? This is a complete joke. We don't. And here's the truth: why was 7-keto DHEA added in 2012? We don't actually really know.
Right.
And moreover, we don't really know how it meets the criteria, because we know for a fact it's not harmful to athletes any more than Tylenol is harmful to athletes.
So why do we not know? I would suggest that one of the reasons we don't know is that there's nobody who's advocating for the athletes here.
Okay, so this is my point. Did the managers and the agents and all the other people and the fighters themselves, in this rush to say, you know what, we want to stamp out drugs in this sport, and maybe they didn't have leverage, but I didn't hear one of them raise their hand and say, there might be some complicating factors about this that maybe we should slow down on, at least carve out some mercy rules. Again, the due diligence argument, I think, Jeff, you have a point. You knew it was on there. But why is it on there? This 7-keto DHEA was not going to make Lyoto Machida win that match, period.
But when you make that argument, you end up sounding like you're anti-drug testing, and that's so. If you're the manager,
I'm anti-stupid drug testing.
I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about if you're a fighter or you're a manager, and you say, let's pump the brakes here. You end up sounding like somebody who's against this testing that is supposed to be forwarding the sport. So it's all about perception. I mean, this is why, again, the athletes need some kind of collective voice that gives them a little bit more, gives them a voice as a group, as opposed to one manager or one fighter saying, hey, on a second, I don't really agree with this. I think this is one of the downfalls. This is one of the many things. I mean, we've talked about, the Reebok, stuff and all that, but this is really a bigger thing than that.
I think if I'm a fighter at this point, I'm pretty paranoid as to what I'm taking.
Jesus,
because
man.
I mean, it seems like we're having some
asparagus and tilapia.
Yeah, really.
We're having some iteration of this conversation. It seems like pretty often. I feel like this is just the latest thing, and it's interesting from a media standpoint as well, because I mean, I'm sort of having to learn about all these things that are coming in supplements on the fly, because we're seeing these things come up. I guess this is all part of that backlash when we talked about how will this affect everything when USADA came aboard and all the out of competition testing started, and we didn't know exactly. I think we suspected we were going to see a lot of this, and I feel like we're finally at that moment. But man, I feel like we got to work through some kinks as we go along.
Here's what I think it is. Okay. I think it's hysteria over supplementation. That's what I think this is. I think it's everyone who puts up these photos, look at so-and-so in the post-USADA era, and there's no difference at all, or the difference is lighting, or this is some totally unscientific. As someone who has taken virtually everything at GNC and somehow still hasn't found a way to make it to the UFC yet, I'm here to tell you that it does provide benefits. It does help you. But there is a complete rationality of this argument, an understanding of what they do and what they don't do. What does it mean to be performance enhancing? Really, what does that mean? Because here's creatine, and I'm about to take some creatine here on the air, because I actually haven't had my dose today.
If I can, need a credit card to chalk that up a little bit?
If I can fish this out, and I take CreaPure. I actually do my due diligence on this, because there's a lot of bad creatine on the market.
See, we don't get this with Hell One, and we don't get these demonstrations.
Well, some of us just like to poison themselves, and that's
he's
me.
He's a natural guy,
Here we go, a little creatine I'm going to take today. I take it every day because it helps. But the truth of the matter is, if I drink this glass of excellent creatine-derived CreaPure, if y'all want to sponsor me, hit me up. If I drink this, watch this, and I'm going to have this, and this is what it's supposed to look like. If yours turns a different color, you're
do I have to catch you when you fall?
You're buying bad creatine. Here we go, ready?
Go.
Can I beat Cain Velasquez now? Hey, does this make me, now that I've taken this, can I turn into the Incredible Hulk like Lou Ferrigno? Oh, wait, you mean it'll help me a little bit over time in the gym while I'm pumping iron? Is that what it's really going to do? This conversation is based around people who have paranoia about fighters. I always knew this guy was using. That they believe this USADA system is fail-proof. It is not. It is an institution run by humans. It was forced on fighters like that. No questions were asked, and we are now beginning to see the cracks in the system. Supplements are not banned by USADA. They are good for fighters, not all of them, of course. And if you're going to have the due diligence issue, where is the mercy for guys who clearly aren't that big a problem?
I'll tell you one thing. It's the fighters going on Twitter and basically piling on in these situations has gotten a little out of hand. You wonder at some point when you're like, okay, guys, which rocks come from glass houses? And when does it come back around to those guys? Because like you're saying, I mean, not all of these are the same. These are not. It's
Dan
not
Henderson,
steroids.
he did it legally, but he took TRT.
Of course, and
TRT is a billion times more effective than 7-keto DHEA.
Yeah. And he was one of the ones who was tweeting. Obviously he has a right to be upset. His fight just fell through at the last minute.
Jeff, last question for you about this. There is one element here, and I think it's a question Ariel would bring up. I don't want to speak for him, but I'm guessing he would. He got out right in front of it. He said, you know what, I did take this substance. I am sorry about this, and I admit it. And in fact, in the statement that UFC put out, they said, we'll take that into account.
Right.
Do you think this means that I'm being hysterical, and that they might wind up saying, okay, there won't be a 2-year ban. Maybe we'll just give you 9 months.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're being hysterical at all. And I think everything you're saying about this is well taken. Specifically with Machida, I was very impressed by his statement. Even though it began, I thought, as I started reading his statement, I was thinking, okay, here's the same old statement where someone's going to say, I didn't know it was in, I didn't know this was banned. And he said that. But if you continued at the bottom of these, he just said, I'm sorry, I'm responsible, this was my fault. That's all I wanted to hear. Everything else, he could say anything else, but as long as he acknowledges that he's the guy who didn't notice this is on the list, and he took the stuff and he accepted responsibility, he's fine in my book. I have no need to demonize Lyoto Machida. I think that he made a mistake, and hopefully he won't be dealt with the same way that somebody who took something more serious.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was the right way to handle it, and ultimately I mean, we were just talking about Romero. I mean, Frank Mir as well, like just recently, and he's
Well, Frank Mir had like, maybe I ate exotic meats. That's not the same thing.
True.
Lyoto
100%.
said, I took this, yes.
No, I'm not saying that he was saying that he was basically saying he wasn't sure how, this got into a system, and I feel like that's your typical thing. I'm not saying he's guilty or anything like that, but it was a little refreshing, I guess, to see a guy with that sort of apology.
Yeah. So what's a fair punishment here? Romero got 6 months, but that's a very different issue. What do you think about this one?
Man, I don't know. I would say something in that range, but I mean, I haven't really thought that through. I would think in something like that, where like you're mentioning, and like I said, I'm learning about this type of stuff on the fly. I'm not a guy who knows everything that's going on in the supplements and what's on the ban. I'm learning as I go, but ultimately, I would say something along that 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that because of Romero's a funny case because for so long people have whispered about him, about the way he looks and all that. What is he taking? What is he doing? And then when he ends up finally popping for something, it turns out that it was something that he apparently didn't even know was it was mislabeled. So I feel like he's the baseline of the lowest. He shouldn't have got anything, basically. I don't think Romero should have got anything, but he did. He got 6 months. And I don't think this should be 2 years, but I would sort of put it as more than 6 months and less than 2 years. A year, 9 months, whatever it happens to be. Because I agree with you, this is not a serious substance, but it is an oversight on his part, and I think it would be a bad precedent to say, okay, well, you decide this is not that big of an infraction, and you acknowledge that you took it. So we're not going to fine you. I think they sort of have to come down a little bit harder than they did on Romero.
I think there should have been a grace period for supplements like there was for the IV ban, and they didn't give one because there's no representation for fighters. I don't know what's going to happen here. I think anything more than 9 months to me seems unconscionable, but I don't know what they're going to do. Just remember real quickly, WADA added meldonium. Remember the thing Sharapova was caught taking for. Then they come back a few weeks later, and they say, turns out we got excretion times wrong, and a bunch of guys who we said should be banned and punished for this, we can't actually say scientifically they took when we say they took. They make errors all the time. It is not the fail-proof system that everyone sort of presumes it to be. Also, this creatine from Pure, it's delicious. All right, let's move on to another issue if we can. I don't know what's going to happen. We'll follow that along. Another sort of sad bit of news. This one, in a serious and somber way, doesn't affect just one guy, but all of us here. There was a fighter, João Carvalho, who died in a show. I believe it's called Total Extreme Fighting. It was the first event, if I'm not mistaken, in Dublin, Ireland. He was unfortunately killed as a result of, we think, what happened in the bout, although I hesitate to even say that. One of Conor McGregor's teammates was the guy fighting, although that's not relevant really here nor there, although Conor McGregor has somehow been thrust into this story in an interesting way, both because of the profile he brings to Irish MMA and because of his proximity to the bout generally. Jeff, I'll start with you here too. There's a lot of questions that have yet to be answered. What went wrong?
I don't know. When I saw that someone had posted this fight, or at least a portion of this fight online, I felt a little bit, ghoulish in clicking on it and to watch it. But I wanted to.
But you had to.
But I felt like I had to see it. And when I saw the way that fight ended, all I thought was, "This. I've seen a million fights end this way." It was not like this. We've all seen those fights once in a while where someone's just getting beat on.
How about from Sunday, Cannonier versus Asker?
Yeah,
terrible stoppage.
Actually, even last night, I was sitting with my wife watching television, and we flipped channels, and all of a sudden we're on Fox Sports 1, and they were replaying the Jędrzejczyk Penn. Was that the one? Was it Penny? Yeah.
Yep.
Fight.
That was brutal.
And we caught it in midstream, and Penny's face is like bloated, swollen, bloody. It was a complete mess, and she's just getting pummeled on. And I thought, this is just horrible to watch. Well, the fight that happened in Dublin was, it was a fight. It was a typical fight, and that was the chilling thing for me. That it wasn't some instance where some guy didn't get saved by the referee in time or something, but it was just like what it seemed to me like almost a relatively typical knockout, and that was kind of a chilling experience to watch.
I think it was you who posted the Twitter of him at the weigh-ins.
Yep.
And you're looking, you're trusting, I guess, that he looked well. There are no obvious red flags that you can tell. It felt like
it's not scientific, but
it's not scientific. You're never sure, what conditions this guy might have had, if he was nursing some kind of injuries that we don't know about. You don't really know the full extent of it. But he went in there, and I agree with you guys. I wasn't sure what to expect in seeing that fight. This is just one of those weird things. Some of the most brutal, everybody knows what they're kind of signing up for in this sport. Everybody knows what the goal is in this sport. Unfortunately, those stakes exist. It is literal. It is a literal will on will, one man forcing his will on another. So these stakes are possible, especially if the guy's not well. This is the same week when it's learned that Dada 5000 suffered 2 heart attacks in his fight and almost died, or was technically dead for a little bit there. It's a crazy sort of thing. But I agree with you. I think sometimes you want to look at a video and say, like, there's the point. Remember the kid from Duke Rufus's? There was a moment when they were just, the guy's checking his phone or whatever, and you see the kid is just sort of falling over, and you're like, well, that should have been a red flag. There's a red flag. You can't see that on here. Those old like when you see the old boxing fights, was it the Benny Parrott when he got killed? It was almost like Emma Griffin was just pounding away, like obsessed. That looked brutal. That's what I was wondering if you'd see. That wasn't in evidence on this one. I don't know. It's one of those things that you just have to be like, wow, man, how unfortunate, and what you have to sort of wait for stuff to come out of it.
And you know, now we have 2 of these examples within the last few months. You mentioned the Dada 5000, but that was one where we kind of could take this almost moral high ground detachment of, well, this is a guy that didn't belong in the cage. He was not in the right condition to be competing like this, and so of course something like that's going to happen when you have a freak show fight. Blah blah blah. We go on and on about why that fight was wrong from the get-go, and of course it ended up being almost deadly. But this is a guy who we don't know. I don't know much about this guy, but it was fighting in a real MMA event. He looked like an athlete, and it makes it even more. It almost seems kind of random until we find out what's went on. Hopefully they will conduct the investigation in such a way we'll maybe learn what it was that happened to this guy. But because if we don't find anything, it's going to seem pretty random. Like this could happen anytime, anywhere.
It really makes me wonder about the Houston show, right? If that was unregulated, what would have happened to Dada 5000? It seems to me a minute or 2 of difference in medical attention could have made all the difference in the world. And this is sort of my point about the show. Look, I'm sure that the promoter is a well-intentioned guy. He did hire, I think, a company called EventMed, I think a third-party service. They do have some experience based on their website in doing other events. I've reached out to them for comment. I have not received one back at the time of this video, but in the event that they do, I'll share that. But there's just no substitute for proper regulation. A promoter is never going to know how to do proper regulation. It's not what they're good at. They're good at, ostensibly, promoting fights, putting things together, local advertising, and barking people into the carnival. I wonder what you guys are going to think about the fact that the Minister of Sport there said there's going to be an investigation. Now, I don't know if that investigation will be fair, but it seems to me at a minimum there should be one. To me, it's very simple. If someone dies at your show, I'm very, very reluctant to say, it's okay, it's an accident, these things happen. I don't think dead bodies is the cost of doing business. I really don't. What do you think is going to happen with this investigation? I mean, we're just guessing here, but try to make an educated one. And what do you think is the future of Irish MMA? Conor McGregor's hotter than ever, but I wonder could this be a tipping point, a backlash? Jeff, what do you think?
I mean, I think you kind of hinted at one thing that will determine this for me at least. I mean, I don't really know where the Minister of Sport, is that the name of the?
I think I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. I don't know what the relationship that person has with the sport, and whether this is going to be kind of witch hunt thing, or if it's going to be just like, see if we can just have an investigation, sweep things under the rug. If they do a thorough investigation, they really talk to all the people involved, not with some kind of agenda, but really, with an agenda to find the facts and find out what really happened here, not to try to vilify the sport or to try to make excuses for the sport, but to actually come right down the middle. Then I think that's a good thing. I mean, the presence of Conor McGregor's name being attached to this
very interesting. It changes the whole dynamic.
It brings it big.
Yeah. I mean, already the sport has been under a microscope for a long time through various channels, and I feel like the referee's job in most cases is to err to the side of caution. If somebody's in trouble, they step in there. We've seen plenty of examples where the guys are very late to stop a fight, and I feel like that's something that has to be examined. If you're going to look at it, there should be making determinations within that. I know Herb Dean was on Ariel's show kind of explaining, like, how do you judge a guy when he's out, when he's not. And it's literally like a guy sitting there staring and making that judgment on the fly. This case was a little different, obviously. Like you said, there was no outward.
Real quickly, though, you had mentioned the fact, and I agree with that if you watch that video of the stoppage, it appears non-controversial.
True.
But even Conor McGregor said, well, that fight went way too long. Where's the rest of the footage?
That's true.
I want to see the beating that kid took.
We didn't see that. That's absolutely true. We saw the video I saw was only the last minute of that fight. And, he was holding on. He was very coherent. He was intelligently defending himself in the moments. He kind of wobbles as he comes backward toward the camera, and that's the only moment you see him maybe in trouble. I don't know. You remember with Dooku Kim and Boom Boom Mancini, so much was changed after that fight within boxing. They added another rope to the ring. 15 rounds became 12. There were so many modifications made, and you're never sure, what this means in the open. If it was a UFC fight, you almost wonder how that ripple effect would take that, take down the sport, take it down a notch. You're not sure, but since it's over there, I feel like it's going to be one of those things that they have to do the investigation. You have to maybe find out if you had some kind of condition that we didn't know about, and you never know. But I don't think there's anything that's inherent about, like, when you look at the sport that they could do different. I mean, there was nothing in that tape that says, like, hey man, this guy was in trouble.
Nothing in the tape, but we don't know. We don't know what happened. Not even before this.
Can we agree? There's a ton of unknowns here.
Yeah.
And for me, people being like, well, I don't see any obvious, things we can point to. I'm like, there is so much we don't know.
Right.
We really don't know what he said to his corner. We really don't know. EventMed, from what I can tell, and I can't say this for certainty, but I looked at what services they provide, seems to me like mostly blood work. That's not rigorous examination at all. Sure. So I'm really wondering, this is why I think the investigation, again, I don't know if it's going to be a fair one, but someone's got to get to the bottom of this. It cannot be this kid just died, spontaneous combustion. This is medical science. It's not magic. So what went wrong? Let's figure it out.
And also, we have to think about, not to discount the tragedy of this, but to also look beyond it for where the sport sits. I mean, you mentioned Boom Boom Mancini. He was a star in the sport. This was not an event that was involving one of the stars of the sport. This was not a UFC event. Now, the UFC, of course, does a lot more with regard to making sure athletes, or at least doing their best to make sure that athletes are prepared before they step into the cage. There's a lot of testing, a lot of medical verification, let's just say. But people out there don't necessarily look at the subtleties like that. They say this happened in Ireland. Well, let's apply the same kind of condemnation to the big show, the UFC. And so I think that's one of the things we'll have to see, how this will affect the bigger show, and whether they will also get lumped in with this kind of thing.
It's a great point. Chuck, do you think, is there any kind of bleed over for UFC?
Well, I don't know if you were mentioning Conor McGregor, and obviously him kind of issuing a statement on behalf.
Conor, sure.
And so I feel like that sort of brought the spotlight over to the UFC somewhat. But so, I mean, it doesn't help. It certainly doesn't help the cause. It's funny because here we are legalizing. We're talking about legalizing here in the sport, and here
same
we have
day.
Same day as a death, and Dada 5,000, same week as him, kind of divulging all that stuff. But on whole, the track record has been, compared to boxing, who has a much longer history, it has not been that bad. Mostly when there's weight cutting incidents, there's usually some kind of backstory there that you can look to and say, like, this all went wrong, this guy should have never been fighting, something like that. I feel like in this particular one, you just have to wait and see kind of what comes out of it, but I don't think it's going to reach too deeply into the UFC. I feel like the UFC does a pretty good job in terms of all of that protocol, getting the right medics there and everything for every show,
it's
even
not
though they regular.
To me, it's not an accident. It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, not to say that this can't happen on the UFC's watch, but just think about some of the situations that have come out of that promotion. Stefan Struve, a guy who was a good heavyweight and was kind of sidelined right in the middle of his career because he had health issues. Dan Hardy, another guy.
Yeah.
These are. Like you said, it's not an accident.
Thiago Alves.
Yeah.
Remember that fight when John Fish got stopped?
Exactly.
Right. It's not an accident. You're right. This is when these kind of things happen. It and the UFC can absorb those kinds of losses without and the show goes on. Maybe some of the smaller promotions don't have the kind of money to do as much testing. And also, if somebody is their top guy and they don't have many other people, then it's a real bummer for them when they have losing some guy because of a health issue. Well, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and lose that guy because it's not healthy for him or her to be in there.
I think you're right. I think the safety record of the UFC, including no death, no paralysis, right? Not even that,
right.
Will ultimately shield them in the event that something happens. but to me, like with what happened with Dada 5000 and what happened with this terrible tragedy in Ireland, it just reminds you that the athletic commissions, we goof on them, but holy crap, it is not a coincidence that I think all but one case of someone dying in MMA happened in unregulated territories. It really is quite important. Yeah. All right, moving on to a gentleman who is going to be returning to the octagon, a beloved figure, but a strange one. BJ Penn is back, and he's going to be taking on Dennis Siver. I believe, UFC 199, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
This was announced to a collective... I don't really know what the response was to this. So look, I'm of two minds on this one. The UFC also put out a statement saying they had investigated the allegations against BJ Penn related to what had been, described as sexual assault, and found that there was, basically he was, even Jeremy Botter saying that this was not real. Okay. In the end, I don't know what happened, but okay, that's not a part of the conversation anymore for one reason or another. What is what is happening to BJ Penn? This is going to be a 145, which I find a little strange, but okay. The Dennis Siver fight, it is entirely unexciting, right? But so that's my one thought. But my other thought is, maybe that's what he needs. Maybe this is a climb back. I mean, look, we were talking about this morning. The last two fights for Dennis Siver were the Conor McGregor fight. Okay, he lost that, no biggie. Conor McGregor's really good. And then he lost to Tetsuya Kawajiri, who's not even in the UFC anymore. Right. So, Chuck, I'll start with you on this one. Is this the right fight? How do you feel about it? Where are we headed with this one?
I think it is the right fight, ultimately. Both 37-year-old guys, both have been around for a long time. Dennis Siver obviously is not the name brand that BJ Penn is, but he's fought a lot of good guys. He has some good victories in the UFC. He's obviously a little bit on his in the twilight moments of his career. He gets to fight a guy like BJ Penn. So from his perspective, that's cool. And BJ Penn coming back, you look at who that guy has fought over the last like seven or 8 years. And I mean, really his whole career. He's always stepped in against the best talent available. I mean, guys even back, like going back to Jens Pulver and guys like that, they were at the apex of their careers, fighting Nick Diaz, fighting John Fitch, who was on a roll at the time. Everybody stepped in. GSP. All these guys are at the top. Matt Hughes, and that was his last win. Was UFC 123. It was a 21-second knockout. If you go back to 2009, he's 1-5-1 since that time. He can't step in there on a return fight. If he's going to do it, he can't step in there against one of these monsters in the division. I feel like for him to sort of, get his feet under him and see what he's got, it should be against a guy where Dennis Siver is at in his career, basically. Especially if he's got Greg Jackson working with him. They're tweaking all this stuff, and we hear all the philosophies going in behind that. It's sort of intriguing for me. So I feel like this is the best fight for them. Better than the Nick Diaz one, or Nick Lentz one that I know that they were sort of talking about for a long. Maybe that's part of the reason it was met with the blah that you mentioned, because for 2 months I felt like we knew he was coming back. It was just a matter of when he was going to come back against who. But to me, this is the right guy. I feel like they got the right one here.
Yeah, I mean, what is his intention? Does he want to build himself back up into something of a contender, if he can manage that, or is he coming back to make a big splash and make some money? And I mean, this is not a big money fight, but I think it is the kind of fight that will give us a sense of where BJ Penn is at. I don't think. What did we learn when he fought Frankie Edgar? Not that much. Frankie Edgar was at such a different level than he was in that third fight that I don't feel like we learned that much about BJ Penn. This fight, we're going to learn something because
See, are you sure about that? If he loses, I agree. If he loses to Dennis Siver, I mean that's.
Well, I guess that's what you're
but
right.
If he wins, I don't really know what we.
You're right. I think that's. I mean, I'm sort of in that mindset that if he goes down to if he loses again, but this time not to Frankie Edgar but to Dennis Siver, then we've learned something. You're right. If he does go out there and beat Siver, then what do we have to do? I guess you have to bring up the 1 or 2 notches up. But still not at that high level. I think that I get the feeling if he wants to build himself back up, it's going to be a slow build.
Here's what's interesting to me, because we have this weekend UFC on Fox 19. And we talked about it a little bit last week, but to me there's I don't know if there's a parallel. It feels like there might be a parallel here. You've got Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, they tried to find a fight on short notice. That's not what BJ Penn and Dennis Siver is. This is a fight that's been announced well in advance. Right. Assuming that there's no injuries and those fights go through. But you've got Khabib Nurmagomedov getting what is basically a tough fight, but a tune-up fight, at least by MMA considerations. Yeah. It feels to me like the Siver fight is also a tune-up fight. So are we just speculating here that UFC is making a promotional kind of change as the sport progresses and the organization develops, or is this just coincidence?
I think it's coincidence mostly. I mean, in the case of Nurmagomedov, let's face it, they booked him originally to fight Tony. It was going to be that was a big fight. They've tried to make it twice. That's a hell of a fight to come back after 2 years. That was going to be a very difficult fight for him.
Oh, the Ferguson fight?
Yeah, the Ferguson fight. But then I felt like, maybe it was because you suggested it last week. No.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what that was.
But only when that fell through did they go with Horcher, and I feel like that was just more of a makeshift situation, sort of win-win, I guess, because if he wins, he just gets to go. He has a lot to lose, obviously, if he loses that fight. But I felt like it made sense if he's going to stay on that card, to give him a guy that he should beat. It's like that's the whole definition of one of these types of. One of these stand-in fights is like a guy that they should beat. So in that case, yes. And in the BJ Penn, like I said, he's fought so many of the best names in the sport for so long, and started to fall off of that top level. You're actually bending down to where you think he might be at this point. And I feel like that's the best gauge for a guy like him. But I still feel like the UFC is trying to put together, for the most part, the two biggest momentums they can with the biggest stakes they can. I feel like it's more coincidental at this moment.
Yeah,
Jeff, is it coincidence?
I tend to think so, though. I do think that there is maybe a little bit of an overarching philosophy that, obviously they were putting together a fight against Ferguson, which was not at all, but that's not the kind of fight you want after 2 years of being absent.
That's an insanely tough fight.
But they did have a sense. We talked about Khabib against Cerrone. There was all the talk about that, and instead, they stepped back and said, "No, we're going to give you a guy who's a newcomer." So they at least had that sense later to ease off the pedal a little bit. And I think the BJ too. But of course, these are guys that are a different level. We have one guy who's having the prime of his career stolen from him, and now he's going to hopefully resume that.
Right.
Versus a guy who's been around for forever, and he's in the twilight. And what is that twilight going to look like? So. I don't know what do you think? You think it's a philosophical change? Or?
Here's what I'd say. There is again, I don't know if the parallels are intentional, but to me, it does feel like they're experimenting with whether. Look, we know tune-up fights work in boxing, and I have been a big proponent of them in MMA. But the truth is, we don't know. I think they work, but we don't really know how well they work at the elite level, because we don't ever see them used. And of course, Dominic Cruz comes back and everyone's like, well, Dominic Cruz, he can do it. I guess everyone else, I guess I could take creatine and do what Dominic Cruz does. Okay, but the point being for me is this. In a sport that is super chaotic, you zig when you're supposed to zag and you wake up looking at the lights. When you take a fight like Nurmagomedov did against Horcher or Horcher, however you pronounce it, and then when you're like Penn against Seaver, there's no room for error. None. Right. You cannot lose these fights. And that's true in boxing too, but in boxing you don't get sparked out quite so easily, and you can manage things very, very simply, because if you are with Top Rank, they'll even let you take a fight. Let's say you're Mexican, you can take a fight in Mexico against someone manageable and then come back and headline a pay-per-view in the States. This is not quite that. And so to me, I think the UFC's not definitively declaring we're in the era of tune-up fights, but they are experimenting a little bit, and I wonder how it's going to go.
You never know. With some of these guys, like I don't know how much Daryl Horcher. I don't know anything about him really, because
he's a good fighter. He's a very good fighter.
So and it's like we're talking about guys. It's the old cliche, these 4-ounce gloves. But if a guy gets hit clean, that changes everything. We see it all the time.
Especially a guy whose timing has been resting for 2 years.
Exactly, and that's the whole point of it. Like you were mentioning, you have to go in there and not only work on your cardio and all the ring rust. That way, it's all of your timing and movement and just the feel for the fight game again. That's probably. I'm not a fighter, but I would guess that's a very difficult thing to do, and not everybody's going to be Dominic Cruz, who I think is able to go all that time and look exactly the same or even better, like he said he was going to be. I feel like Magomedov has had a very tough time mentally through this whole thing. I feel like it's the perfect fight for him, but it's very dangerous, because if he loses this fight, he loses his footing in that division where he was already the #1 contender.
And I think we can acknowledge that as the UFC has entered the era of way more fight events and way more fights, and that they've had to, almost out of necessity, open up their definition of matchmaking. Look at the UFC 200
a smorgasbord of logic.
Because we cannot go through an entire MMA Beat without mentioning the UFC 200 main event. That kind of fight wouldn't have happened a few years ago. They would have said, well, this guy's the champion in that division, so obviously he's going to defend his belt. Now they're starting to do things a little differently, and they're chasing the dollars as opposed to just chasing the logic of the pecking order. And I think this is a little example of that in a different kind of way. They're saying, instead of saying, well, okay, BJ Penn's coming back, we need to put him in there with the best guy, somebody who's right at his level and make that match because that's a perfect match. No, we're going to give him a fight to see where he's at, and maybe we won't get the definitive answer if he goes out and wins, but at least we'll be building toward an answer.
Well, real quick, one last question about BJ, and then we'll move on here. I wonder if he's still uniquely at risk, where if he goes out there and blows the doors off Seaver, which is entirely conceivable, even a diminished BJ should be able to do that. Is that going to be the moment where it's like, okay, he got the Dennis Seaver fight under his belt now, time to go fight Aldo? Yeah. And I wonder, do you think that might happen too? Like, part of me is, part of me wants to be like, win a round, push it to round 2, and then go do your thing. But I wonder if he's just going to come out there and blitz him.
We are so enamored with what just happened right now that's that would happen. If you went in there and smoked Dennis Seaver, that there would be that sort of thing, because the
fans can't help themselves.
They can't help themselves, and he's training with Greg Jackson. Suddenly we'd be like, well, we saw what he did with Arlovsky. We saw what he's been. You know what I mean? We would, that would be the case. That people would then put BJ Penn up here. But I think you have to see a bigger, example of fights than just Dennis Seaver. And I hope that they just don't. I mean, let's just say that happens, I hope they don't throw him in there with a monster the next one, because it was really hard to watch him in those last couple of fights, particularly that Frankie Edgar one. It was like you're watching a shell of the man, and he had no business in that cage. So unless he's turned a corner, and I know Greg Jackson really believes he has, I need to see a couple of fights before I want to see him in that sort of situation again.
And what's the money fight? Again, it comes back to the money. And I don't think right now, the way BJ Penn has performed in his last bunch of fights, there isn't really a money fight right now.
Point, yeah. I'm not sure what that is.
But he goes out there and he smokes some guy who's making it doesn't matter if he's just making his UFC debut, because he's just, that's the other thing about the uniforms. I mean, the fighters all sort of come out there looking sort of pretty similar. They're all wearing that same Reebok outfit. So BJ goes out and beats anonymous fighter X. All of a sudden, he's back in there, back earning dollars. And let's put him in a money fight. That's the whole thing.
And I will say this for BJ Penn. Besides his trouble that he just was exonerated with and all that stuff, it seems like he's in a very good place. And all of the team and Jacksons who've talked about him, they seem to think like, man, what a great guy. He's come in, he's helping me train.
I see him in fighter Instagram videos all the time.
Yeah. And it's just, I feel like this is a very healthy thing for him on that level. I think he's best. He doesn't put himself into bad positions in life. If he's got something like this going on, I just hope he's able to manage himself a little better going forward.
Well, we'll see. From BJ to GSP. Now, I know we've talked this topic to death, and we're going to continue to talk this topic to death, but I feel like it is slightly different now. Okay, so he gives a bunch of interviews, or maybe one interview, but what I saw him say, and it was in French, but the translation was basically the following. And my takeaway was that it is not a matter of if, it is now a matter of when. That they are in good terms, they are talking, but there are some hurdles. And this is a super interesting story to me, because what he basically said was, my contract's old. Like, it was in place before the Reebok deal ever was. Oh, by the way, I'm not sponsored by Reebok. I'm sponsored by Reebok's competitors. So how are we going to work this out? Here's my guess. There's no way they don't make a deal. They're going to find a way to make a deal. But the nature of how they make that deal, and I don't know what that's going to be, I think, and I could be wrong, but could have massive implications for the Reebok deal itself, for other athletes they acquire. They could have, maybe some guy quits the NFL and joins UFC. I'm just, it happened with Lesnar. I'm not NFL, but exactly, but comes from a different world and then enters this one with a bang. I think it opens the doors to all kinds of possibilities. I'm not saying, Jeff, that the Reebok deal is going to unravel, but are you like me in thinking how they make this deal is of massive consequence?
Yeah, I hear you. I think that's true, because, earlier we were talking about USADA and how the fighters don't have a collective voice, and Reebok is of course the same situation. There's no collective voice for who's protecting the interests of the fighters. And so, obviously, things haven't gone the fighters' way during this deal. Well, what's the one thing that can turn it around is when you have a big star. If I remember, when Ronda Rousey or Conor McGregor or someone else decides that, this is not working for me. I can make more money by wearing Nike, or I can make more money by doing this or that. So you get a big name fighter who has that kind of leverage, and GSP has a lot of leverage because, hey, he could just stay retired, or if you guys want me to come in there, here's how we're going to play the game. I think it's going to be real interesting. I don't think it's going to have a kind of impact where, Joe fighter way down in the prelims is going to have is going to have any leverage. But I do think that it's going to spill down below GSP to, all those people who typically would fight on, say, the main cards.
Okay, well, Jose, if that's the case, Chuck, you're going to create a two-tier kind of system. There's the fighters who get to do what's good for me, and then the rest of them get to do what's good for thee.
Right.
And I think that, I don't want to be melodramatic. I'm not calling it a caste system, but that seems to me, at a minimum, an unequal system.
Well, it's complicated with GSP, too, because he's been so big for them in the Canadian market and everything else, everything he's done for this sport. I remember it was this time last year in Montreal when he was there just answering questions, and that was brought up specifically. It was like, how would the Reebok deal affect your decision to come back? That was a big sticking point for him. He said that would have to be worked out. He wasn't sure how that would work. And here we are, I guess, to the moment where they're trying to solve that. How much sway does he have? In 2013, he walked away from the game. What was his big contention? He said, I don't really want to be in this sport unless they're going to start testing these athletes and stipulating that he wanted to see tests being out of competition.
Right.
Well, guess what? That's what they do now. This was a GSP galvanized event. I feel like he was the big catalyst for this whole thing that's going on. So if anybody's going to change the game that way or change the sort of concept of where they're at,
a great point.
It might be him.
Yeah. The thing that you mentioned about the potential for like a caste system, I do think
I don't want to call it
well,
that. I'm just trying to identify
but the difference between the main in the card guys as opposed to the prelim guys,
so something like that.
I do think that eventually it would spill down to everybody. I just think that they're not going to have that immediate sway like the main people do. I think that it's kind of one of those things where change, because there's no fighters union or association, the change happens very slowly, and the glacier pace of it will be that maybe the top money earners, and then the people who all wear championship belts, and then the people who contend for them, and then the people who are top 5 ranked, and then the people who are top 10. So eventually I think everybody's going to the managers who maybe some manager who represents 2 champions and has like 7 or 8 other clients eventually is going to find a way to get those other clients a better contractual situation
Reebok has
too.
been very savvy about exclusively dealing in the bigger athletes, like grabbing those guys and making them part of an exclusive sponsorship. So it'd be interesting to see maybe they come to the table differently for him. I don't know how they work it out, but obviously when you're dealing with like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor and these people who can make lots of money through their sponsorship, and if they're happy, you feel like they might be able to solve something with George St-Pierre.
Can you imagine St-Pierre walking to the cage in a non-championship Reebok kit? It just doesn't even feel right.
No.
I don't know what's going to happen. Let me ask you this: true or false? When he walks to the cage, ultimately in his return, and who knows when that's going to be? Does he do it in Under Armour or Reebok? Jeff?
Both.
No,
I think I think he'll walk in Reebok, but I think he will be paid handsomely for it. I think that they'll find an opportunity there. Reebok, I'm talking about.
Yeah.
We'll find an opportunity there to pay him a lot.
I agree with that. I think ultimately, if they figure out the deal, it's going to be through Reebok.
I think he'll be in a Reebok kit that looks special for him, kind of like the green shorts that McGregor wore, and you'll somehow know about Under Armour, one way or the other. All right, we're almost out of time. Just a few minutes left here. Real quickly, we have UFC on Fox 19 this weekend. We talked a lot about it. I guess let's end on a happy note, given some of the more dour topics we've had to.
Sucks, man.
Yeah, this sport is dumb. Jeff, I'll start with you. Fight you are looking forward to most this weekend?
I think I'm kind of interested in seeing Rashad Evans. I mean, I don't know why. Just
do you think it's it for him if he loses?
Maybe that's. I don't know if it will be, but I kind of am leaning in that direction, thinking it will be. And he's had some moments, but then he's had some bad moments. And I'm always interested in watching that guy compete. So I guess I'm really leaning toward that one.
Chuck, how do you feel about that?
Shogun and Evans, man. That Shogun's not.
Oh, dang.
No, Nurmagomedov and. Wait, so that's.
I was looking forward to seeing Lyoto Machida then. Oh.
No, I would say definitely the strawweight fight for me. You know, Rose Namajunas in her last performance. I mean, that was to me was like spectacular in her win over Paige
really
Van
good
Zandt.
one. Yeah.
So I feel like that's the big showcase, and I feel like Tisha Torres in the opposite end, undefeated fighter. That should be a good fight.
And they fought before, and this is a good measuring stick for
that's a good one.
the Rose Namajunas. I agree. That's my one too. The Rose Namajunas one. No love for the Bellator card, huh? No love for Anastasia
You're
Yankova.
quarterbacking this.
I'm just asking. Look, the answer can be no, Jeff. This is a safe space.
Yeah, the answer is probably not that much.
You gonna watch that at all? The kickboxing?
Anastasia?
Yeah, no. Well, I mean the kickboxing, the
You
Bellator
watching
kickboxing.
Anastasia?
Yeah, I know you will, you perv. All right, well, I think that's it for us. We're just starting to get off the rails here a little bit. I want to thank everyone who watched.
That's your creatine reporting.
I feel like I can take on the UFC heavyweight division now because I do creatine. I read the Twitters. All right, I want to thank everyone for watching. Shout outs to the world's best Washington Nationals fan, Ariel Helwani.
Yes, go Nationals.
He loves Bryce Harper. I do too, Ariel. It's okay. And of course, thank MMA Fighter for putting this on. Thanks for everyone in the crew who has made this happen. And I'm stammering now, so I'm going to end this for Ariel, who's not here, for Chuck, for Jeff. I'm Luke. This is the MMA Beat. Hands up, chin down, let him fly. See you next time.